Hello and welcome back to Women's Business Voice. In this exciting exclusive series entitled From Side Hustle to Empires, Histories of Working Women's Lives, we are featuring a series of conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of expert historians. I'm your host, Angela De Souza, and shortly I'll be handing over to Amy. The series as a whole explores the relationships between gender, work, and career in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what's not about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. The series takes a look at not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden histories of women who have made a living in systems and structures not often designed with them in mind. Today's episode is entitled Women of the Exchange, Stockbrokers and Financial Advisors with Professor James Taylor of the University of Lancaster. Over to you, Amy.
Hi everyone, and thank you if you are joining us again. Thank you for coming back. If you have come across this episode, then thanks for listening in for the first time, I guess. But we're here in order to talk across a series of different episodes about women's working lives. I'm a historian myself, I'm Amy Edwards, but each episode I'm being joined by different people that I know through my working life who are experts in different aspects, different industries, different experiences that women have had in relationship to work. So this episode in particular, we're going to be looking at the history of women in the world of finance, which is actually an area that is a bit closer to my heart. Or at least my own research expertise, but we also have with us Professor James Taylor, who has recently written a book on just this subject. So we're very lucky to have him join us today. And as I say, James is a professor. He is at the history. Sorry, my goodness. He is a professor in modern British history at the University of Lancaster, and his work explores like business history. He kind of takes social and cultural perspectives in the ways that he does that. He's written on all sorts of stuff. The history of company law, of white collar crime, of financial advice, popular investment and advertising. But as I say, he's recently just published this book, which is called Sexism in the City, which is a title that I think is really cool. And I love the cover is also very nice, I should say. But it's about women stockbrokers and a kind of long history actually of women stockbrokers. So I guess we can crack on and start talking a bit about that, James. But before I do, and before we get on to our particular subject, I wondered if you could start by just telling us a little bit more about how you came to write about women stockbrokers.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, it was really a bit of an accidental project because at the time I'd been working on the history of the stock market more generally in the 19th century. And one of the really interesting sources to use for that is the digitized newspaper press, because you can do lots of exciting keyword searches and really dig into things like how the stock markets are imagined, how they're represented, what people are saying about them, find out something about how the markets are actually working at a ground level. And I was really interested in stockbroking as a profession and was looking into that. And without looking for them, I began to find references to women who were acting as stockbrokers in the later 19th century. And I'd never read about this. I'd never thought that it was possible that women were working in this market at this time. So I kind of made a note of it because it wasn't really what I was looking for and moved on. But then found another reference and then another one, and I began to think, hang on, I might be onto something here, because whenever you find something that you're not supposed to find, that gets you thinking. So I began to plan an article on these women, these two or three cases that I discovered. But then it just snowballed from there, really. Moving into the 20th century, I found more women who were working in this market. And then beginning to explore their struggle to get membership of the stock exchanges because they were barred. And so I had all these, really fascinating questions. Who were these women who were becoming stockbrokers when they weren't supposed to be in this field? How and why did they get into finance as a career? Were they successful or not? And so what I planned as an article perhaps ended up being quite a long book, frankly, which you referred to earlier, which was published earlier this year.
Yeah, great. And I guess to begin with, I should say, so I'm someone who tends to research the 1970s and 1980s, so you might have to help me out here and be my guide. Could you explain to me, to us, anyone listening, what the world of stock markets and finance was like in the 19th and then into the 20th century? Like, what did working in finance entail? What kind of people worked there? Tell us a bit more about that world.
Yeah, it's really, I guess it focuses on the profession of the stockbroker. That's the intermediary who connected investors with the market. So if you're an investor, you've got some money to invest and you want to buy shares in a company or invest in government bonds, then you're going to have to do it through a stockbroker. And sort of going back a long way, back to the 18th century, then brokers were it wasn't really a recognized profession as such. But as the market grew, then you begin to see people who initially had started out just broking in lots of different commodities and items begin to specialize in stocks and shares. And so they begin to be called stockbrokers. And as early as 1773, a group of brokers formed the London Stock Exchange, the first version of this institution, which was to become really big and famous. By the end of the 19th century, it had grown so much that there were around 5,000 members. So this is a really big institution. And we tend to focus on the London Stock Exchange because it's the one that everyone's heard of. But there were also lots of different stock exchanges up and down the country. By the mid 19th century, the market's grown enough, particularly with the development of the rail network. That was the thing that really got the market going. And if you're living in, say, Manchester or Glasgow or Leeds or somewhere like that, you might prefer to deal with someone locally rather than having to sort of trust someone in London that you've never met before, perhaps. So that encouraged the growth of stockbroking in lots of different towns and cities. Basically, by the start of the 20th century, pretty much every town, certainly every city, had clusters of stockbrokers. And in the larger towns and cities, they would meet and trade stocks and shares in a stock exchange. And as markets became more essential to daily life, stockbroking began to attract the upper middle classes and even some aristocrats. So it went from being a slightly kind of not entirely reputable activity to becoming very, very respectable part of the establishment, attracting men who'd been to public school. And that public school ethos began to affect the culture of these stock exchanges, I think.
And so, in terms of that culture, I guess perhaps I might be reading into what you're saying here, but some of the implication is that that culture is quite masculine, or that the stock exchange isn't a particularly welcome space for women in the late 19th, early 20th century. Is that fair to say?
I think so, yeah. I think gender looms quite large in these financial markets because obviously on one level, when you think about money, about finance, you don't necessarily think of that as having a gender, as being something that is gendered. But really, when you look at the history of the markets, it does become gendered and quite early on. Because if you go way back to the 18th century, sort of the early 18th century, before the London Stock Exchange formed, there was still a stock market, but people traded shares and government bonds in the coffee houses that were very popular in 18th century London, and even in the streets and alleyways around those coffee shops. So it was a completely informal market. And you can find evidence that in that very early market, women were active not only as investors themselves, but they were also sometimes acting as intermediaries on behalf of others. What was particularly common was where a woman would invest on behalf of other family members. So husbands or brothers or children, that kind of thing, and then begin to invest on behalf of family of friends as well. So you get women kind of before the stockbroker became a kind of established figure, an established profession. Women were essentially acting in that capacity, but they were never really fully accepted because what you see in times of crisis, particularly with things like the South Sea bubble in 1720, this famous stock market mania where the market boomed and bust. Women, because they're active in the market, they're visible, they often get the blame quite unfairly for when things go wrong. So with these periods of speculative excess, it's the women who can't control their emotions, who are gamblers, they're upsetting the market. And so there's this move to really begin to exclude women when the market becomes more institutionalized. So when the market moves into these stock exchanges, you find that women are not welcome there. They're not formally excluded, but it was never really on the cards that women would become members. And in particular, a whole sort of mythology grew up about the trading floor and what that was like, the violence of the trading floor. This was a really hyper-masculine environment where it was all about the survival of the fittest. So it just seemed like common sense that that was a place for men and that women weren't really welcome there. These were essentially male-only clubs. And that's where that sort of public school ethos comes in. It's all men together, all boys together, that kind of thing. So for a long time, it wasn't really debated that women could or should be allowed into these very masculine spaces. So women were welcome as investors, but it was the belief that they had to find a man to manage their finances for them. And they certainly needed to find a stockbroker if they wanted to invest. And that remained pretty much unchallenged, I found, from the late 18th through to the late 19th century. But it did begin to change in the 1880s, quite suddenly, because the market was doing so well by that point that you begin to see the market moving outside of the stock exchanges, and what were known as outside stockbrokers began to do quite well. So these are people who aren't members of stock exchanges, so they're not subject to any rules or restrictions, and they begin to do quite a lot of business with ordinary investors. So that meant that suddenly there was no longer this barrier to becoming a stockbroker. And that's where I began to find examples of women acting as stockbrokers. They were these outside stockbrokers. So they could build a viable business, but didn't have to become a member of a stock exchange. So the first example that I found was a woman called Amy Bell, and she set up a business in the mid 1880s. She was someone who got into finance when she was a kid. She just became fascinated when she was flicking through the Times and she found the financial columns. Perhaps slightly unusually, she just became obsessed by the numbers and what do all these numbers mean? What are all these companies listed in these exotic, far-off places? So she just became fascinated by the markets and started, even when she got a bit older, started managing the investments of family members. And she started saying, I'm going to become a stockbroker. And at that point, her friends thought, well, this is a nice joke, but it's not possible for a woman to become a stockbroker. Because, for example, women couldn't become a clerk in a stockbroking firm. That was the most typical way that a man would become a member, that you'd become a clerk, start on the bottom rung and work your way up. You'd learn the ropes that way. Amy couldn't do that, so she just took this huge leap. She grew up in Bristol, but she moved to London, set up a business in Bloomsbury, just started appealing for clients, and it worked. She built a few clients and then was able, after a couple of years, to move into the City of London and had her own office that was quite close to the Bank of England and the Stock Exchange. And she built up a very viable business. And it was all based on women investors. So that was her sales pitch, that at a time where women weren't really taught much about finance and weren't encouraged to have their own financial autonomy, they grew up in ignorance of finance. And that meant that when they went to a stockbroker, they didn't really know what they were doing. They had to ask a lot of questions. And what Amy said was that a lot of male stockbrokers just couldn't be bothered. They didn't have the patience to genuinely help women learn about finance. So that was Amy's niche. She found her own kind of gendered niche in the market where she would educate women investors. She would take the time, sit with them, talk them through their options, teach them how to manage their own finances. So it was an educational business as much as a regular stockbroking business. But it absolutely worked. She found enough clients to keep this business going for about a quarter of a century. She traded and then she retired. And when she retired, she handed over the business to her cousin, Gertrude Brooke. So it was quite nice that she secured the succession of the business into the next generation of women stockbrokers.
Yeah, amazing. And I mean, always nice to hear about a historically cool Amy, I should say. But I guess, I mean, her story suggests you must have found just a load of very interesting kind of cool women who were working in these unusual ways or kind of pioneering in different ways or coming up with challenge like coming up against challenges in different ways. So are there any of the particular characters who stand out from your research who worked as brokers or financial advisors or anything like that?
Yeah, there's quite a few, and that was one of the fun things of the project. Really, was the human dimension of it. To think not just in terms of institutions and structures, but to really find out the real people, and their stories and their lives and careers. And it was frustrating because some women you would find occasional references to them, maybe not just in the press, but in trade directories. You would try and trace them through the census and things like that. But they remained quite elusive. But others were really quite well known in their day, even if historians lost sight of them. So it was really fun to get to know some of the better documented cases. So one would be a woman called Beatrice Gordon Holmes, and whereas Amy Bell was, as I was saying, was much more interested in like dealing for women investors. That wasn't so true of some of the women who came after her, the next generation. They were more interested in trading on equal terms as men rather than setting up different kinds of stockbroking businesses. And some of them were hugely successful in doing that. So one of those was Beatrice Gordon Holmes. I'm calling her Beatrice, but she went through life. She preferred just being called Gordon Holmes, which is quite interesting. So she dropped the Beatrice at an early point. And she worked at an investment trust, and her big break came with the First World War. And you see this in other walks of life as well, that with men being called up to fight on the front, women often got their opportunity, their big break to fill these shoes and to show that they could do the job. So that's what happened at the investment trust, that she ran the business basically more or less on her own. And as she complained later, without a pay increase, but very successfully, that when the men came back at the end of the war, they all had their jobs to go back to and the business was flourishing. But the problem was she was working for a boss from hell, basically, and she had to step away from the firm. She couldn't deal with him anymore, but she took a male colleague with her, and together they formed their own limited company. And they started out really small as you can. They said in two small rooms with two typists. So it's a big gamble. They didn't have that much startup capital, but it worked really well. So they set up their own investment trust, and they went on to establish a string of successful companies. And by the 1930s, she was earning about £5,000 a year, which was a huge sum for the time. And she became quite a celebrity. She was often in the press, and she even wrote an autobiography. So this is a really nice example of someone you can really learn a lot about her life and her career and her thoughts and what she thought about her career through her autobiography, which was published in the 1940s. And as I said, rather than Amy Bell, who set up her own kind of specialist business for women investors, Gordon Holmes was much more interested in just catering to all investors, whatever their gender. And she said that male clients often preferred to deal with her, basically. So she quite liked dealing with the male clients. But at the same time, she was very conscious of being a woman in business and was keen to help other women who wanted to get a foot in the door in this kind of work. So in 1938, she was one of the founder members of the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So this was an association, a network that had been established in America, but they were keen to develop it in Britain as well. And Gordon Holmes was the first president of this association. By the end of the Second World War, there were over 100 clubs and they had over 6,000 members. So this really took off, and she felt passionately that it was her job, having been successful in business, to open the door to other women, to help them network, to give them the confidence to intervene in public debates, and to be more prominent in business. So Gordon Holmes was one of the the favorite cases that I had. But whereas she and Amy Bell were both working in London, it's also interesting to look at those women who were working outside of the center of finance, but were trading in some of the towns and cities across the country. And in some cases, those are the ones that it's perhaps harder to find the details about. But one was Edith Midgley, who worked in Bradford in Yorkshire. And her career trajectory was really interesting because she started pretty much at the bottom, but gained this opportunity to work as a stockbroker's clerk. So this was the difference between the early 1900s and the 1880s. So financial firms began employing women as secretaries, as typists. And they weren't doing it necessarily because they were that progressive, but they saw women as a pool of cheap labor, basically, a group of clerks that you didn't have to promote. They didn't have any career expectations. They would leave when they got married. Indeed, there was the marriage bar that was the norm at that time, where firms felt able to sack women as soon as they got married. But it gave women at least this foothold. And Edith was an example of a woman who was able to start at the very bottom in a stockbroker's firm in Bradford, but she worked her way up really high, became one of the senior figures in the firm. But it all went wrong when she said, well, I'm senior enough, I think, to join the Bradford Stock Exchange now. I've trained men who have joined the Bradford Stock Exchange, so surely I should be allowed to join as well. So she was one of the first women to really put this to the test, this key question: can a woman join a stock exchange? And it's funny but sad at the same time to kind of trace this history, because the stock exchanges were clearly, they didn't have a clue how to respond to this. This wasn't what a woman was meant to do, start applying for membership. So Bradford contacted London, and London said, no, you shouldn't admit women. And so Bradford actually passed a rule saying we will not admit women. But this didn't stop Edith. She kept applying. She applied all the way through the 1930s. She applied 6 times. You get a sense of her personality, where she just wouldn't take no for an answer. She took this principled stand. There's no reason why I shouldn't become a member. So she left the firm she was working for. She set up her own firm. She traded successfully into the 1950s. So with her stubbornness in keeping on applying for membership, she got a lot of attention. There was a lot of media coverage of her cause, and it won a lot of public support. So she was one of the first women brokers to actually get this question into the news, into the public eye. Why was it that stock exchanges weren't admitting women to membership? And so that question became a bigger deal after the Second World War.
Amazing. And again, so cool to hear about the particular histories, or the particular lives of these different women, and how they faced similar but different challenges. And yeah, I really love the research, James. And I mean, I guess you sort of brought us nicely up to the Second World War. And because I'm someone who works on the late 20th century, I'm going to drag you in my direction, which is, can you tell us, I guess, some of the end of that story? I know by the 1970s, or in the 1970s, women are eventually allowed into the stock exchange, but there's obviously some stuff that happens to get them there. And yeah, take us to the end of that story of women finally being allowed to become members of the stock exchange.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and it took quite a while to sort of piece it all together, because there's lots of stages for it. But what you basically see after the Second World War, the idea of women working in a stockbroker's office is become completely normalized, really. They are there. Some of them have achieved pretty senior positions, but there's still this kind of quite persistent glass ceiling that it's still not on the cards that they're going to be allowed to join stock exchanges. And that's significant, not just for its own sake, but also because you have to be a member of a stock exchange to become a partner in your firm. So this is what women who are working in these firms are really resentful about, that they want to become partners. They want to be equal, and they're prevented from doing it. So in the 1960s, you get a couple of very well qualified women working for London firms who try and get membership, and they're rejected. And in the event, you have 3 big votes of the entire membership of the London Stock Exchange, obviously entirely male membership. Should we allow women to become members or not? So 3 big, very high profile, this is in the press, big set piece debates and votes. And each time the prediction is that they'll vote to allow women to join. This is, after all, this is the swinging 60s. This is a time of great change, cultural change. Everything is looking very progressive, very rosy, new enlightened attitudes. But each time they have a vote, they vote to keep the women out, basically. And this just becomes more and more controversial. But it's clear equally that no matter how many votes there's going to be, they're always going to vote the same way. So this seems to be a complete dead end. And I think it's two things that changed that situation. One is that there was the threat of legal action, because you begin to see this in other fields, like the particularly high-profile case in the mid-60s where a woman who trained racehorses tried to get a training license from the Jockey Club, racing's governing body, and they wouldn't give her a training license because of her gender. And so she launched a legal action, and that basically worked, and they had to step down. She became a trainer. And that had relevance for institutions like the Stock Exchange, who were still holding out against allowing equal rights on membership. And you see that in the minutes of stock exchanges where they are talking about this, it's very much on their radar. So I think that was one aspect, but the main one was that in the 1960s, there are moves to amalgamate the nation's stock exchanges. So you've got these stock exchanges up and down the country, but they're mostly not thriving outside of London. The market is becoming more and more concentrated in London. People are doubting whether these small regional, provincial stock exchanges are really viable anymore. And as a result, those smaller regional stock exchanges begin rather quietly and without much fanfare, they begin allowing women to join. And it's really, again, not necessarily because they're that progressive, but it's a bid for survival. They'll accept women as members to show that they're still viable autonomous units. But the problem is when this amalgamation of the stock exchanges actually happens, there was a vote for it in 1972, you've got this weird situation where, because if you're a member of a regional stock exchange, with the amalgamated stock exchanges, you have rights of access to the London trading floor. So if you're a woman stockbroker in Nottingham, say, you'll be able to have access to the London trading floor. But if you're a woman stockbroker in London, then you won't have access because London doesn't allow you membership. So it would create this bizarre two-tier system, which even the London Stock Exchange had to admit didn't make any sense. So it was really through that administrative issue of amalgamation, rather than an actual sort of positive, progressive vote for equality, that women actually finally got the right to join on equal terms. So that was in March 1973, and there was an initial cohort of 14 women who joined the stock exchange. But so on one level, obviously, this is a huge turning point. This is a big victory for women. But on the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that attitudes don't really change that much in light of this victory. More women join in subsequent years, but the culture of the stock exchange remained very masculine. And it's not that culture changes to accommodate the women who are now joining financial institutions in larger numbers. And so I think that continues to create some problems.
I mean, I'm just imagining being one of those 14 women who, like, on the first day that they're allowed in the London Stock Exchange. That must have been quite an experience. And I suppose we've probably only got a couple of minutes left before we should start wrapping up. But I guess that leads me to ask, you mentioned that attitudes don't change that much. So what's the situation now? Has there been this great kind of, you've done this big history, I suppose, of women in stockbroking. How much did things change? How much did things stay the same? Is, I guess, the question.
Yeah, this was a really interesting one to pursue, because the way that you imagined this story that I was researching and then trying to share in writing this book, and the whole thing was pointing towards 1973 as this big victory. And in many ways, I imagined that as the end point of this history. But then I felt it was important to kind of think about where that leaves us today and what happened in the 50 years or so after that. And as I began to think about that and look into that, it was it was more the continuities that stood out to me than the changes. And that was in some ways quite surprising because a lot changes in terms of the stock market, how stock exchanges work. After 1973, you've obviously got Big Bang in the mid 1980s, the big deregulation of the markets. And one of the implications of that was that it sort of puts an end to the trading floor, basically. And the trading floor and the hyper masculinity of the trading floor was one of the big arguments for why women shouldn't be allowed to join stock exchanges because they wouldn't be able to operate equally on that kind of in that kind of environment. But that doesn't weaken the idea that finance is a masculine occupation. If anything, it gets stronger in the 1980s with the sort of popular image of what the markets are. And you think of Wall Street, the Oliver Stone movie with Gordon Gekko, and all of these kinds of emblems that people have. You can think of Loads of Money, the satirical TV character, kind of waving his wad of cash around. So money, finance, financial careers are still sort of coded as masculine, are still imagined as masculine. And it was really interesting to talk to one or two of the pioneers of the women who joined the stock exchange in the 1970s, and also to read interviews with other women who worked in finance. And it was very common for women to paint a very positive picture of their careers and to say that my gender wasn't an obstacle. The markets are gender neutral. It was all fine. Everyone I dealt with were lovely people. And yet you dig a bit deeper, and it isn't to deny that reality at all, of course, but you still find the culture of finance being gendered in subtle and sometimes less subtle ways. So when you look at it historically around the turn of the century, so the start of this century, you start seeing lots of very high profile lawsuits with women accusing their firms of discriminatory behavior. Some of the details coming out of those cases, when you look back on them, are pretty shocking, to be honest. And then you get the financial crisis of 2008. And that was an interesting one from the point of view of gendering the markets, because of course one of the big firms that went bust in America was Lehman Brothers, and that sort of triggered a debate about gender in finance. And a common thing you would hear said around that time was, if only it had been Lehman Sisters, then we wouldn't have had a financial crash, because women would have been, would have judged the markets better. They wouldn't have been so reckless. They wouldn't have, they'd have been more responsible. And so that was a sort of a very different kind of debate in some ways to the sorts of historical debates I'd looked at where women were often blamed for crises and speculative manias. So you think, oh, this now looks like a big turning point. This is the point where we can admit that women have a legitimate place in finance, and that men might be the problem, not women. But then if you look at it after that and what happens after that, again, there's these continuities. You get several Treasury investigations into the financial sector after 2008. And there are lots of government moves to try and open up finance, particularly senior jobs to women in finance. There's a charter that's launched in, I think it's 2015. But these inquiries show that there's still this very masculine culture. The most recent inquiry reported at the start of 2024. And that was actually the most damning report of all. It actually seemed that things were getting worse. It particularly highlighted the extensive use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, to cover up the extent of misogyny and sexual harassment that women were facing in these financial careers. So really, to sum it up, it's kind of, if you look after 1973, it's quite a mixed victory in some ways. So it is, I think, genuinely an important historical turning point, but we shouldn't simplify and just think, well, that solved everything, that made finance egalitarian. It just shows how impervious that culture is to change. And I guess one of the reflections on that as a historian would be that institutions today need to know their history, need to think about their history if they're really keen to change culture and actually move towards a more progressive culture today. Because I think there's still that weight of history, in a sense, all those gendered attitudes to finance that might still be getting in the way of change today.
I mean, thanks, James, because I think that is a really great point to kind of end on. And also suggests, if I'll say it, even if you're not comfortable doing so, how important your book is, as well as telling us that history and showing us how long women have been involved in finance, even in many ways against the odds, and showing us, as you say, some of those big important changes, but the kind of long continuities, that particularly in relation to the role that gender has played in that industry. And so I guess for everyone else, if you want to hear more about people like Edith and Gordon and Amy, then you should totally pick up James's book. It's really wonderful. So that's Sexism in the City, Women Stockbrokers in Modern Britain. But that just leaves me to say thank you so much, James, for your time and for being with us today.
No problem. Good to talk to you, Amy. Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.